Just 12 miles north of Milan sits the quiet town of Seveso, Italy. In 1976, on the morning of July 10th, residents went about their day like any other. They never would have believed that the chemical manufacturing plant, which provided so many jobs, would be a source of widespread illness and contamination when a gas leak occurred that afternoon. Unsuspecting residents would soon be exposed to toxic levels of what is often considered one of the most dangerous chemicals ever created. The plant was owned and operated by the Italian company Seveso, which stands for Industrie Chimiche Meda Societaria Azionaria, which is a subsidiary of Guidovan, which in turn is a subsidiary of Hoffmann La Roche Group. The plant was located in Meda, Italy, and it had been operating north of Seveso for 30 years with very few minor chemical exposures prior to 1976. Because the citizens of the region did not view the plant as a threat or dangerous area in general, very few people were concerned after the gas leak occurred. Even the workers in the plant did not know the extent of the toxicity of the chemicals that they were producing and working with. Unfortunately, the chemical gas that was released included 2,3,7,8 tetrachloro-dibenzodioxin, which is more commonly called dioxin. This is a very widely known chemical, and its most popular use was in the Vietnam War as a component of Agent Orange. It is a persistent organic pollutant which remains in the environment for a very long time after exposure. This persistence greatly affected the primarily agricultural-based economy of the region and had a great deal of effects on the economy of Seveso. The most affected area was Seveso, giving the disaster its name, but other contaminated areas were Meda, Desio, and Cesano Maderno, small cities that were located nearby the plant. There were many failures that caused the gas leak to occur, and problems with the response to the exposure that had long-term consequences. It mainly occurred because a law in Italy required the plant to shut down on the weekend. So, while other plants of the park began to shut down, Building B was still in the middle of the last step in the distillation process. This step removed ethylene glycol from the reaction and was working with a lot of very toxic chemicals. With the decreasing power consumption across the plant while other buildings began to shut down, the load on the turbine decreased, which increased the overall temperature in Building B. Operators were unaware of the increase in temperature because they didn't have a steam reading temperature gauge on their instruments. So they continued as they normally would and stopped the batch after the distillation process. At this high temperature, runaway decomposition began, which increased the temperature further. Hours later, the reactor relief valve eventually opened because of the high temperature and released the toxic gas into the air and over surrounding areas in an unprecedented amount. Although still debated, it is estimated that 34 kilograms or higher was released. Earlier estimates ranged from a few hundred grams to a few kilograms. The toxic cloud covered the town of Seveso, and the wind carried this miles south, exposing other communities. Citizens and public officials were unaware of the hazards of exposure, and even workers in the plant were not aware of the danger. Officials stated that everything was under control, but there was very little communication between the company's authorities and the public. It wasn't until 10 days later that the company confirmed that dioxin had been released. At that time, expert committees were created and asked to evaluate and solve health risk, decontamination, and socioeconomic problems caused by the toxic release. These solutions were then passed down to a regional council for approval. The decisions were made unanimously and not put up for discussion. The Seveso Special Bureau was then created to implement the measures decided by these expert committees. The Swiss multinational Roche, who owned the plant ultimately, claimed that they had no direct effect for the responsibility of the disaster. However, they offered their support to regional authorities for cleanup operations. Actual effects of the toxic cloud were not noticed until small animals began to die a few days later. This was then followed by deaths of larger animals, and eventually people began to show symptoms of toxic exposure. Animals were primarily affected because the toxic chemical was in their food supply. Some of the symptoms that appeared on humans included skin lesions such as chloracne, patchy coloring of the skin, decreased liver function, blurred vision, and nausea. These symptoms were primarily noticed in children because they received a much higher toxic dose of the chemical. Long-term exposure to dioxins can have much more devastating effects, such as impairment of the reproductive system, developing nervous system, and others. The most vulnerable populations are pregnant women and young children because of its effect on developing systems. Residents of the town and other affected areas were eventually evacuated by authorities and treated for the exposure, but this took days to coordinate and even longer to follow through. Over the following months, people around the area were advised not to eat any food grown or meat produced in the contaminated area in order to prevent further contamination. The region was divided into 3 zones, A, B, and C, according to the level of exposure, and were repeatedly tested for traces of contamination. This event occurred during a time of great social and political change in Italy, and so one of the largest controversies about this disaster was the temporary legalization of abortion for pregnant women who had been exposed to dioxin. This was a major reaction to the accident for the traditionally conservative Italy and a major win for advocates of legalization of abortion. The disaster is often cited as one of the largest man-made environmental disasters in recent history and has had many outcomes. Seveso has often been used as a model for failures in emergency management and is used as measures to improve. Although no one was ever prosecuted for the accident, new legislation was enacted to improve safety in plants, create emergency plans, and inform the public about potential dangers to their safety. The Seveso Directive was adopted by the Council of Ministers of the European Communities in June of 1982, 6 years after the disaster. Many epidemiologic studies have been ongoing in this region to determine the long-term health repercussions of the accident, and these will continue to monitor the health of people in the region for years to come. Even today, there are still scars that remind the city of Seveso of the accident that occurred over 30 years ago, and action is still ongoing to make such a disaster such as this one never happen again.
A disfiguring skin disease called chloracne. So far, it seems, children are the worst hit victims. Many had played within a quarter of a mile of the factory for up to 5 days before their parents were made aware of the danger. They'd been outdoors in the summer sun, wearing only shorts and t-shirts. The outcome is all too evident. It was only 4 days after the factory accident that the first child fell ill. Now at least 27 children from Seveso itself are still suffering badly from a hideous disfigurement which keeps them confined indoors.